Good morning. Shall we start this two-day conference on media freedom in volatile environments? 2 intense days of panel discussions, and sometimes you will deserve a coffee, even a reception at the end of this day. Volatile environments. Volatile means risky. We choose this word. It's the core business of our office, of the representative on freedom of the media, to defend the protection and the freedom of journalists, even in the most difficult circumstances. I will serve as your moderator this morning. My name is Thijs Berman. I'm principal advisor here at the representative on freedom of the media. Let me first give the floor to Ambassador Florian Raunig. No, first one thing, this whole conference will be web streamed with footage free of rights available to all. That means that if there are any camera teams, we will kindly ask them not to walk around too much because that might disturb our speakers. And as I say, it is web streamed. Ambassador Florian Raunig, head of the 2017 OSCE Austrian Chairmanship Task Force, you have the floor for introductory remarks.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm overwhelmed to see how many people are attending this opening session. Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by commending the RFOM office for organizing this conference and thank them for inviting me here to say a few words on behalf of the Austrian OSCE Chairmanship. As you know, Austria has taken over the OSCE Chairmanship at a critical moment. In too many places, we see grave threats to peace and security, not least the crisis in and around Ukraine, which remains a central focus for this organization. In view of such challenges, the Austrian Chairmanship has focused its priorities on contributing toward diffusing conflicts and on helping rebuild trust and confidence between the OSCE participating states. Ladies and gentlemen, building trust requires open and constructive dialogue. Free media is essential to creating the right conditions for such a dialogue. Thanks to courageous journalists, all of us here are informed on issues that affect our lives. Journalists also shed light on incidents of violence, torture, discrimination, corruption, abuse of power, and much more. And this is an essential first step to accountability. An independent, professional, and pluralistic media is indeed a core element for a healthy democracy. And freedom of the media is also crucial for the protection of human rights and can contribute significantly to political stability and security. Yet, security and free speech are often pitted against each other, as if one comes at the expense of the other. In order to achieve sustainable security, there is an urgent need to dismantle the idea that security and liberty must be balanced against one another. If interlinked, journalism can create opportunities for non-violent responses to conflict. In November this year, the Chairmanship will host a meeting to evaluate the interrelationship between a free media and security and share positive examples, such as peace journalism as an effective tool to foster sustainable security and regional stability. In this regard, I look forward to hearing some positive examples and counter-narratives to tackle issues such as propaganda, disinformation, and so-called fake news, which are of central focus of this conference for the next 2 days. And by this, I wish you a successful conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. And then the floor is to Frane Marojevic, our Director of the Office of the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media. Frane.
Thank you, Thijs. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, and dear guests, thank you first, Ambassador Rowning, for your remarks on behalf of the Austrian chairmanship, and also thank you very much for your support to the work of the office. I would like to welcome you all to this beautiful city of Vienna today. We enjoy a wonderful sunny day, but unfortunately we'll be here indoors for most of it. But you can enjoy this magnificent Hofburg Palace from the inside. I would also like to thank you all for joining us today. The fact that we have a very full room here today, and as you can tell, it's not a small room, shows great interest and the need to engage in a discussion about the topics on our agenda. For everyone who closely follows the work of the OSCE, it is apparent that this organization is at the forefront of dealing with the crisis of in and around Ukraine. And our office has been engaged since the very start of the crisis more than 3 years ago, working closely with many partners in the international communities and the NGOs, but most notably with the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine and the Russian Union of Journalists. Since 2010, these two professional organizations have engaged on difficult issues facing journalists from the two countries, working under the slogan, "Two countries, one profession." While the challenges faced by journalists working in and around Ukraine is the context of our discussion today and tomorrow, we can only learn and benefit from broader experience of everyone in this room. This is why we have invited journalists and experts from the whole OSCE region. I'm sure that we are all looking forward to an open discussion and an opportunity to share your experience and expertise on issues relating to the problems faced by journalists and media workers in volatile environments. Some would say that most, if not all, journalists work in volatile environments, dangerous places where the situation is liable to rapidly and unpredictably change, usually for the worse. They are professionally obliged to accept a certain degree of risk, just like other people working in volatile environments, such as medical workers. But just like doctors and nurses, journalists deserve respect and protection as they do their work in interest of the public, their audience. This is not my view. It is something that the OSCE participating states agreed as far back as 1991, to quote, "to adopt where appropriate all feasible measures to protect journalists engaged in dangerous professional missions, particularly in cases of armed conflict, and states will cooperate to that effect. These measures will include tracing missing journalists, ascertaining their fate, providing appropriate assistance, and facilitating their return to their families." Then in 1994, the participating states condemned all attacks and harassment of journalists and pledged to endeavor to hold those directly responsible for such attacks and harassment accountable. Safe working conditions for journalists have been long at the forefront of OSCE commitments of media freedom. However, as we have seen in almost every conflict and crisis, there is a multitude of issues that affect journalists and their safety. There are people far more qualified than myself in this room to talk about these issues. This is why I'm honored that we have today with us one of the most experienced war correspondents, Kate Adie of the BBC, as a keynote speaker. She reported from almost every war zone and crisis, from both Gulf Wars, the wars in the Balkans, covering the troubles in Northern Ireland, Rwandan genocide, a British military intervention in Sierra Leone, bombing of Tripoli in '86, Iran embassy siege in London, Tiananmen Square protest in Benji, and so on and so on. I heard that the British soldiers used to quip that as soon as Kate Adie would come, there would be trouble. I was always fascinated how on the screen she always was cool, calm, and collected, while all around her there was mayhem. And we look forward to hearing from her in a few minutes. People need the media in order to make informed choices, based on facts gathered by professional journalists. In the absence of reliable information, populations will fall victim to disinformation and propaganda, which leads to fear, anger, not based on verifiable facts. This also brings them to choices that are perhaps not in their interest. This leads me to the second point. Nothing spreads as easily in times of conflict as fake news. Fear will carry even the wildest rumors. Now, while this may perhaps serve some objectives, it is clearly not in the interest of the population to be disinformed and manipulated. In times of conflict, the picture of the opposite side is often distorted beyond recognition. Demonizing the other side is as old as human conflicts and does not bring peace closer. This is why immediately after the opening session, we will discuss the not-so-new phenomenon of fake news, which is closely related to its more ancient cousins of disinformation and propaganda. In this context, we are also very fortunate to have with us today David Kay, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression, who in March of this year, together with the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media, the Organization of American States Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information, adopted a joint declaration on freedom of expression and fake news, disinformation and propaganda. Later today, in our third panel, we'll try to examine media literacy as one of the ways to counter fake news, disinformation and propaganda. And then this will be followed by a reception to end this Monday in style. Also later today, we will discuss the issue of freedom of access to information and accreditation of journalists in conflict areas. Tomorrow, we'll come back to the important issue of safety of journalists and the persistent, unacceptable impunity for crimes against media professionals. This will be the subject of the fourth panel tomorrow morning. After that, we will discuss the responsibility of journalists in times of conflict, self-regulation, the concept of peace journalism, and the tension between facts-based professional journalism and demands of the patriotic discourse, which involves a degree of self-censorship and a loss of neutrality. Just to recall that 2 years ago, meeting in this very room, the then representative on freedom of the media set out a series of recommendations to the participating states and to journalists and media organizations. As we are awaiting the completion of the process to select the next representative, we are not able to publicly provide recommendations from this event. However, today and tomorrow, we'll have an opportunity to hear how much has changed in these 2 years. We will conclude the conference tomorrow afternoon with an opportunity to hear the views of international organizations, media, NGOs, and professionals. I'm looking forward to hearing from them. And before passing the floor to David Kay, I would like to thank very much the governments of Germany and Netherlands for their contributions that made this conference possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Frane. Now we can turn to David Kay, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to freedom of opinion and expression. David, please.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Frane. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you especially for including me in this important meeting. And thanks especially to everyone who is here today, especially the activists and the working journalists. I'm here very much to learn, and it's really thrilling to see such a group of activists, of journalists, of diplomats who can engage in these important issues. So the subject of this conference is media freedom in volatile environments, which led me to think about both elements of that title, the media freedom part and the volatile environments part. I want to start by asking what we might mean by volatile environments, and I apologize if I restate what's already been said, and then suggest two sets of needs that we have, I think desperately, to deal with the crisis of media freedom across the OSCE space and indeed globally today. Volatility, under the Oxford English Dictionary, always referred to OED, is given two primary definitions. The first, easily evaporated at normal conditions. The second, liable to change rapidly and unpredictably, especially for the worst. I think both of these definitions are well understood by working journalists, particularly in war environments, but certainly in environments of instability. And I think these are useful measures for analyzing the situation for media freedom today. Is media freedom evaporating in normal conditions? Is it changing rapidly and unpredictably for the worst? There's great variety in media freedom across Europe and Eurasia today, but there is great volatility in almost all subregions and countries down to the local level. By saying this, I mean to say that I understand volatility to mean not just the context of armed conflict. For instance, the situation between Ukraine and Russia, or the internal armed conflict in southeastern Turkey. Rather, volatility must also be pre-conflict. It is those quote-unquote normal conditions, political instability, corruption, the prevalence of localized violence, etc., that we are confronting today across the region. I could name any number of countries, as everyone in this room knows, that fall under this rubric. In many ways, we are facing a volatility that is regional, if not global. In short, I see this conference as an opportunity to think about media freedom well beyond the context of armed conflict, rather to think about it in the general volatility of the environment across Europe today. In these environments, what is it that we need? I would like to suggest that we think about our needs, the needs for media freedom, in two baskets. We need protection, and we need public support. So I'll just say a few words about each of those before turning it over to our keynote speaker. First, protection. We need protection from censorship, and we need protection from attack. And I think that means at least two things. First, it means legal framework. At the international level, we have a legal framework. We have Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which protects everyone's right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, and through any media. This is law that applies to every country in the OSCE space. But at the same time, as we have this very strong international legal framework, at the national levels, we see, again, volatility. We see pressure. We see laws against defamation, criminalizing defamation and insult. We see laws criminalizing government criticism. We see reporting and writing converted into terrorist propaganda in criminal investigations and prosecutions. We see prosecutions for false news. We see internet filtering and shutdowns across the region. We need legal protection at the national levels for all of these things. And then second, of course, we need implementation. Even in those places with good law and with generally good practices, we often lack the tools for compliance, the enforcement mechanisms. We often see that states do not demonstrate the necessity and proportionality of their limitations on the media. We see excessive impunity for attacks on journalists. And then in the second basket is public support. I think it's fair to say that public support for media freedom, for freedom of expression more generally, is slipping out of our hands, and we need to correct that. I think that public opinion that is negative towards freedom of expression and media freedom is bred by cynicism of state ownership of the media, of state domination of the media, and it's bred by political leaders that across the OSCE space are demonizing the media. I think public support is really at the top of our agenda in many respects. So in conclusion, I want to again thank the organizers for this conference, and I especially want to emphasize the importance of the office of the representative of freedom of the media for the OSCE. And I look forward to the appointment of a new representative as soon as possible. And I say this in part because, of course, we know of the strength of the previous mandate holder and the importance that the mandate has for expressing the key norms that apply across Europe and Eurasia, and for providing direct protection to journalists, to editors, to all of those who create the space for media in the region today. So with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to a very interesting and constructive conference.
Thank you, David Kay. You can imagine that your words on the need for a speedy appointment of the new representative go right to the hearts of the staff of the office, you can imagine. And I hope we will have indeed a new representative as soon as possible. Now, it is a special pleasure for me as a former radio journalist and radio correspondent for Dutch radio. To introduce Kate Adie, Frane already told you a little bit of her CV, but I can tell you that younger people amongst you don't know this, but once upon a time we had shortwave radios, and you would listen to BBC World Service, and once you found the station with some difficulty, you were exceedingly happy that you had a news hour, that you had these magnificent radio reporters. And there is a difference between radio reporters just reading a story written in their hotel rooms and radio reporters who went to situations and went on the spot and got the sound on the spot to tell the story with sound and with people speaking about the situation while being in there. And Kate Adie is one of these reporters, and I'm very proud we have her, and I have her left from me. Thank you. Katie, you have the floor. Kate, sorry.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to make one outrageous claim. I think I'm the oldest in the room, particularly when you listen to that list of things, which it has been my, well, I will say, it has been my privilege to report, because I think being a journalist is a privilege. It's a fantastic job. It's a fantastic world we have around us. And what I have to do is just say what it's like. What a fantastic job. I'm still an optimist about journalism. As well as being the oldest in the room, I'm not going to make the claim I've been shot at more than other people. That would be probably just my fault for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, because we don't go to conflicts in order to be part of them and become the story. On the other hand, I've just made a lot of mistakes and ended up, being on the wrong end of things. But what gives me hope is seeing so many young journalists around here today, because we have got to look at the future. Many years ago, I have addressed a good number of conventions and conferences around Europe. And usually, when we were speaking there in those times, we used to talk about freedom of the press and bang on about the rest of the world. They were the people who had to catch us up. They were the ones with the dictators. They were the ones who hadn't woken up to the idea of the freedom of the press. Today, we're looking at Europe, and I feel, it's a personal view, but I hear quite a bit of what I'm thinking reiterated this morning. We are in a deteriorating situation in Europe. We have got to look to our laurels being a wonderful history and tradition of democracy and a long tradition of journalism, and it is being threatened on many sides. I'm old enough to have grown up in a house in the northeast of England full of mementos of war, not medals or photographs of soldiers, but bomb shrapnel embedded in our furniture from a 2,000-pounder which hit our greenhouse. I grew up believing that our greenhouse and its tomatoes were a vital target for bombers. I also grew up aware that my parents, during that war, knew only the official and limited version of events for over 5 years. They learned much more in the years that followed, but they had accepted secrecy and censorship imposed by a democratic government because theirs was a war of national survival, World War II. Europe saw 2 such wars in the last century, and when nations find their very existence threatened, the press joins up, just like a soldier. It's conscripted. The government will make certain it is. And the people, your audience, are also in agreement. You're all together. Now, a war of national survival is probably the hardest war for any independent-minded journalist to report. But I have to say, Europe has seen 2 of those wars in the last century. But since then, most wars have been other people's wars, or wars in which your army has got involved through NATO or some military alliance. And those wars are not subject to that major dilemma about, well, let's call it patriotism, because that's what it is. Afghanistan, Vietnam, Iraq, former Yugoslavia, admittedly difficult for those there. I remember talking to this journalist in Sarajevo saying, we don't do the whole truth because the enemy will learn our weaknesses. Totally understandable. All journalists learn that in a war of what is seen as survival. But most of the wars we're talking about are wars in which we should be taking an independent stance and reporting everything we see. And above all, because all conflicts hold significance, because wars change lives. And it's vital not to forget that it's the duty of a democratic press to report them. And I mean that in all the seriousness that the word duty has. And I say it because I think this duty is under stress, and there's considerable contemporary threats to reporting, both on the battlefield, and I know that is very much the subject of what is being talked about here, but also back in the newsrooms, on the home front. And this is where I am really worried. My views are those of a citizen, a journalist, in a democratic country which has long had a free press, and which has many important media organizations without political affiliation. But we're all feeling the wind of change blowing through our profession, and it's not just the technological advances. As journalists, we tend to concentrate on the physical threats and problems: access, safety, guidelines, equipment. However, we seem to have moved into a world where our very reporting is viewed as questionable. And I'd like to address this, as there is no point whatsoever in going off to war if no one is going to take notice of or trust what you report. Democracies flourish with a free press, and democracies expect and tolerate bad news as well as good news about others and about ourselves. Our democracies in Europe are being tested. Extremes of political view alien to democratic values, fracturing of old political allegiances to traditional parties, several wars on the fringes of Europe of intense, sometimes baffling complexity, and, of course, a surge of terrorism within Europe. Added to this is the challenge of instant communication and the chatter of social media. For many young people, news means 3 brief headlines, one of which is a football result. And then there is the economy of the internet, targeting users and garnering advertising revenue from sites which delight in fiction, fantasy, and newsy gossip, calling themselves the news, which is undermining expensive, well-rehearsed journalism. There is also the increasing reach of TV stations by satellite, whose content is financed and controlled by non-democratic regimes. Time and again, I hear that the only well-paid jobs in newsrooms are those under the directions of the Russian state, the Iranian government, the Chinese government, the Turkish president, and the various sheikdoms of the Arab Gulf. They're neither democratic, nor do they tolerate opposition to the state. And lastly, and I have to say this, the president of the largest democracy, which is a member of NATO, Mr. Trump, is on the record for saying the press are our enemy. Horrendous, disgraceful, and also a beacon of hope to those dictators everywhere who would want to restrict their own press. It is a horrific situation. Cheer up. Most of us are still democracies, and I live in hope for the others. We reporters in democracy still have our fundamental aims: to speak truth to power and to report. Both of those aims are tested when reporting conflict. There are the physical threats, and quite properly we need to discuss aspects of safety, ethical guidelines, status in conflict areas, equipment, and identification. And sometimes today, I think, we concentrate on the physical threats at the cost of the discussion on the wider problems of journalism, called, in my view, the home front, as opposed to the foreign field or battlefield. There is no point. I'm going to absolutely reiterate this, because there is no point in risking your lives and discussing how you can ameliorate that risk if trust in your words is lacking and you can't report all you have seen at home. There is no point. We have to sort out the home front. Much has been made of the phrase fake news. There are many definitions. Stories that are pure fantasy, others maliciously manufactured. Trutheism, terrible word. Conspiracy theories. Public relations gloss, which omits awkward facts. The ludicrous claim that alternative facts exist. And here goes. The interesting fake news cited by President Trump. I can describe that in one sentence. It means anything he doesn't like. And that is specifically his definition. You might sigh as a journalist saying, we've heard all this before, a myriad cloud of lies. However, what we're facing now is considered by many of our audiences to be the norm. All politicians lie. Oh, the press don't tell it like it is. What's a fact anyway? These are not just the mutterings of the disaffected. It's become more mainstream. And it's even been suggested by an eminent philosopher in Britain that what we need is a general theory of bullshit. Today's problems partly stem from the fact that some leaders, influential individuals, enemies of science, deniers of history, and even some governments are beginning to take up these hitherto discredited so-called post-truth arguments, and in doing so undermine the public's trust in journalism. And again, what's the point of reporting from hazardous situations, risking your life, if it's met with, I don't believe it, Twitter and YouTube say differently? Some practical suggestions. We need to have newsrooms with a firm commitment to sticking to the facts, more resources to research and confirm stories, and a robust effort to debunk and expose that which is untrue and invented. If we're determined to report a riot, then we should be equally determined to take down someone's mischievous report that it has not happened. We need to stand by our interviews, slap down invented quotes on the internet. We need to research and confirm statistics, not repeat fluffy assertions from any old source. This is time-consuming, it's expensive, but it is our insurance and our defense. And it also applies to conflict, and particularly with regard to video. Whenever again is trotted out the word, well, I saw it on the television, it must be true. I give you an example. A couple of years ago, a BBC editor was watching another British TV channel late at night when he spotted footage described as recent pictures from the Syrian city of Aleppo. Images of a much damaged street with clouds of dust from shell fire appeared. A small white vehicle scuttled through heaps of stones. He rang the TV channel and they said they'd got the pictures from a Syrian source who'd previously provided footage. Interesting, said the BBC man. Actually, it's me and Kate Adie in our BBC wagon in Sarajevo in 1993. That can happen, and it does more frequently than we care to think. Anyone now can make a video. Certain feature films of war are being happily plundered for material. Vigilance is everything, but so is the willingness to kill the fake footage. At that incident in the BBC, the other channel immediately took down the footage. Try doing that on the internet. Basically, your audience needs to trust your words, your pictures, your accuracy, and your integrity. They matter. Another newsroom challenge is the increasing competition, and this applies very much to conflict, for bloody, gory, grisly pictures. This is a race run every time these days on the internet, especially, as we've seen, by the outrages of Islamic State. How does this fakery and sadistic footage continue to appear? One of the reasons is that the large social networks operating worldwide, with the exception of China, are mainly from American companies. They're based on a legal definition decided some few years ago of a very free version of free speech, much freer than many European countries. The Americans, shall we say, are much more relaxed about violence compared to attitudes regarding sexual images. And the internet platforms have gone into the news business. And no one has yet managed to get these huge, octopus-like corporations, ever growing richer, to behave as publishers with all the accepted checks and balance and legal constraints that have been democratically discussed and accepted. All that's on offer from these mega-rich and increasingly powerful organizations is a small number of so-called moderators to deal with the millions of videos and postings every day. The press is fighting a competitor with no rules. We need to address that. We need to go on the attack. We need to campaign about this. Many journalists find it difficult to criticize other press and media outlets professionally. Okay, from the political point of view, there will always be different political views. But this time we're saying, stop. Your facts are wrong. Your footage is fake. You have invented statements and events. I think we should do much, much more to counter these lies with more facts, supported by evidence and publicly sourced research. You can't call a fish tank clean until the water is clear. In conflict reporting, almost everything is contested. We all know that for obvious reasons. And many governments and the general public have been slow to recognize that technology has provided a more even battlefield for the world's media. For much of the 20th century, many people who wished to protest or dislodge a regime or overturn a government did not have access to the latest equipment, the ability to spread their message in the media and reach the general public. That was until about the mid-1990s. Now it's different. Every street fighter has access to the World Wide Web. The answer, though, is not more censorship or legal prohibitions. It's the need to improve honest journalism, counter the false news, and also question the politicians on your home territory who have a lingering dislike of a free and critical press, but who should recognize that it's a necessary element of a free and democratic society. If journalism doesn't flourish freely on the home front, it's useless on the battlefield. That's the third time I have said that. I have to make it clear to you that I think there's another battle to be fought, and it's not on the battlefield. It is on our home front. The second frequently heard criticism of journalists covering conflict these days is, you don't show us the full story. Well, we know that. But the implication now is that the full story, the real story, is the really grisly stuff on the net. That this is not shown on conventional channels is due to the deliberations and decisions about the acceptability of on-screen violence, with which we're all familiar. But the implication is that the internet, in showing more violent pictures, is actually delivering the real story. Add to this the availability of footage on well-funded satellite stations and the international reach, which are subject to control and interference by governments, and which have a political interest in one side of conflict, the viewer is beginning to feel cheated. I've listened to a lot of people in Britain who now have access to and can download very easily internet channels, 24-hour news, from stations not based in UK or America. And they say, we've seen pictures from Ukraine of American special forces. BBC doesn't tell us that. RT has a lot to answer for. I make no bones about it. But you won't be alone, RT, in the future. Lots of nations are acquiring 24-hour news for their own use. And the people that are in conflict will be seeing two versions of a story in a way not encountered in the two world wars that were fought last century. And we have to be able to deal with it. So what do we do when we have a war to cover? Above everything, get your eyewitnesses. On-the-spot reporting is the basis of verification. When I began working as a correspondent, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, almost the only way to get pictures and the story back to base in London was to get there yourself. British TV News, BBC and ITN had enviable resources compared to many of our fellow Europeans, though we were usually outgunned, I have to say, by the very well-resourced Americans. By the late 80s, we were able to transmit via small mobile dishes, and teams of camera, engineer, producer and reporter were common at all major events. By the mid-90s, the agency networks had arrived. Local camera crews took over, transmitting from their own dishes, speaking the language, knowing the contacts. It became so much quicker to take in Reuters or APTV, and so much cheaper. The habit of sending your own people has come to depend very much on how much national interest is involved at home. And another consequence of the agency or freelance camera, familiar with the territory, knows the language, is that the vast majority of conflict footage that is shown all over Europe today is shot by freelancers, and often without a reporter present, just pictures. Cheap, and you put the voice on at home. What's missing now is the reporter's eyewitness detail, the questioning of local people, information gained from watching, sensing the atmosphere, listening to the stories, the rumors, the propaganda, being able to sift the truth on the spot. I don't really have to say this in front of all of these professionals, but I think we have to remind ourselves of the importance that, especially in conflict, pictures do not tell you enough. Today, there is less money around. Insurance and safety legislation, especially in Europe, are also more prominent. And then there is a sense, and I'm not sure if this is absolutely true, of increased hostility towards the press. I say I'm not absolutely sure because it is a myth, a fairy story, that the media have always been tolerated in battle zones. It's been a fight for almost 200 years. The first still cameras, taking photographs, the French and the British, arrived in the Crimean War in the 1840s. They wanted to take pictures, Roger Fenton was the famous photographer, of the battlefield. No, said the army, kindly wait until we've tidied it up and placed the cannonballs in artistic positions. They've been at it for years, and in a way they're still at it. There is dislike of having the reporters there to witness the dreadful mess. In World War I, a conflict so long and vast you might think that every journalist was there, the British press was met with what became almost the underlying view of the military right through the war. The attitude of the government and the military to the British press in 1914 was a quote from a general who said, "Why can't you chaps wait until it's all over, and then we'll tell you who's won?" There are, I have no doubt, still generals like that today. There is really, even today, no set pattern to conflict coverage. As journalists, you should be heading there yourself. However, even within NATO, countries vary considerably in their tolerance of the media. Decisions are usually in the hands of politicians at home. It also depends largely on whether your own troops are involved. But the key to this is for the media to know or to find out before any conflict and in peacetime just how their government is going to view access and press activity in time of conflict. Don't get to the outbreak of fighting not knowing what your government and military might do to you. Find out, question them. Obviously, some governments these days are nervous of hostage taking, as it may well mean government involvement, however reluctant. Even so, newsrooms ought to have some idea of what they might expect from the politicians. It's a fraught area. As for access, I have well, no, it's not a feeling. I've actually always just acted on it. That if I go to any place where there is conflict, I have as much right there as a foreign army. You wouldn't believe the number of armies who don't believe this. They think they own the battlefield. I've actually had it said to me on the spot. You just have to stand your ground and say, no, you're wrong. Okay, they may have the guns and the strength, but you have moral right on your side. You have a duty to witness. There should be no need for permissions to be granted to cover conflict. I'm going to repeat that. No need for permissions to be granted to cover conflict. Conflict involves us all. If you think of the footage of the last year, what are the pictures of? Old ladies, dead children, youngsters running around, desperate, columns of people under shell fire. Military people do not own the battlefield. Journalists should be there because not only the military take part in conflict, the unwilling do as well. And we are there to report on that. This is forgotten by large numbers of military people and also quite a lot of politicians. We as journalists are responsible for our safety as we are elsewhere. We need to keep out of the line of fire, nor should we interfere with military operations. But that does not mean that we should be herded around like sheep in a pen. Nor does it mean that we should have to attach ourselves to a particular fighting group. Embedding is, yes, a means of access, but it is always limited. Always. It's a form of military control, frequently leading to limited coverage. And I don't think that a piece of paper, some kind of accreditation, changes a thing. One of the consequences of the accreditation argument is that when you face a thug with an AK-47 who is hostile, possibly semi-literate, and possibly drunk, a feature of an enormous amount of conflicts, rarely reported, or under the influence of drugs, also rarely reported, that particular thug is not interested in reading your piece of paper. I can't count the number of times that I have realized that pieces of paper are worthless in front of the determined fighter. The other end of the accreditation argument is that it defines you, depending on who has issued the paper. And it may be well that your gun-toting roadblock creature has no time for a particular government or NATO or the UN or even the Red Cross. Respecters of no one, and do not respect those who issue the paper. I also have to stress that several countries, including my own, have no official accreditation or registration system for journalists. Anyone in Britain can say they're a journalist, and they do. But so far, after 2 centuries of that system, it kind of works. Let me recommend it to you. When considering today's coverage of conflict, everyone can appreciate the advances in technology. But one other major development is less discussed. Factual reporting, obtaining eyewitness evidence, is giving way to emotion. Part of it is the influence of the entertainment industry in the visual media. War is now often seen through the prism of suffering and despair and fear and many other feelings, especially in television. The consequences of conflict are, of course, of immense importance. However, they are often now edging out the horror and brutality and determination of war and the way that it is waged. At the same time, as the claim is made because of technology, that we're seeing war live on TV. Mainstream stations, unwilling to compete with the barbarous images to be found on the internet, prefer often to engage audiences with pictures that elicit sympathy and concern, rather than the grim realities of fighting and bombing. I'll give you an example that during the Second Gulf War, pictures were shown all over the internet, reported by Western reporters of the bombing of Baghdad. An orange glow on the horizon, which was all the reporters could see from central Baghdad. We're seeing it live on TV. This is war, was the claim. No. You weren't seeing anyone dying, fried alive in the flames. The result of that is war. I'm not saying that we should put out the utterly grisly pictures, but to claim that distant shots, and quite often only outgoing fire, are war, is a cop-out, absolutely. And we should be very aware of that. It's not live on TV. This is all a lot of pressure on journalists, because I'm arguing we have to see how war is conducted fully, and all the people involved, not just the military. And with developments of drones and long-range artillery and above-the-clouds bombers, again, the machinery and killing of war is avoided. And often, because of the long range, there is little in the pictures of the results. Just shiny pictures of things outgoing, setting off. Not all the media have shifted this way, but 24-hour news channels tend to take any coverage they can. The considered piece of journalism is now much less popular, talking live, has become the preferred method of delivery, particularly clear in some of the Middle East wars and some of the Middle East media, who have all pulled in their horns, to say the least, since the demise of the Arab Spring, and have almost given up going to front lines because their governments do not want to see who is involved and what is going on. So talking live at a distance and keeping to the feeling and the mood of the people is becoming the way of covering conflict. Sorry, folks, that's part of it. We have got to get in there and find out who is doing what to whom. There are appalling difficulties that face any journalists. I do not envy people having to go in to conflicts today, trying to operate, for example, where Islamic State is holding ground. It's horrifying. But there needs to be more work to reinforce media that are strong, independent, reliable, and honest. Let's all work together on the problems of safety, accreditation, access, allegiance, bias, but let's do that from a base of integrity and confidence, challenging lies and propaganda publicly with well-founded facts and evidence. If we sometimes seem like the lone voices amongst the noise of other media sources, let's make it clear that we have the intention to report both the good and the bad news with honesty. We need to stand apart from the purveyors of fairy tales and the salesmen of propaganda. We need to be the news. Thank you.
How did you like that, to be applauded after a talk? As a radio journalist, you never have an applause.
That's right. In television, you never even meet the audience, which is another sort of little patch of cowardice in television.
A bit terrifying, all these eyes, no? Yes. Thank you very much, Kate Adie, for this excellent and brilliant story with which you shook off the comfortable diplomatic discretion we are used to in this house. It is now time for statements by the delegations. As Kate Adie told us everything, up to us to say the rest. And I apologize, but given you have no cards representing your countries, please, also for those who are not used to this venue, tell us who you are and the country you represent, please. The gentleman over there in white. Go ahead.
Уважаемые дамы и господа, добрый день. Меня зовут Максим Буякевич, я начальник отдела информационных проблем Департамента информации и печати Министерства иностранных дел России. Значение проблематики, которую сегодня уважаемые коллеги будут обсуждать в рамках нашего мероприятия, трудно переоценить. Действительно, проблематика свободы СМИ, прав средств массовой информации на пространстве ОБСЕ в условиях турбулентности приобретает особое значение. На наш взгляд, впервые с момента окончания Холодной войны порядка 25 лет тому назад все страны пространства ОБСЕ и их информационные ресурсы сталкиваются с беспрецедентными вызовами, к числу коих прежде всего мы относим следующее. Во-первых, это практика функционального, законодательного и политического ограничения работы средств массовой информации на пространстве ОБСЕ. Российские новостные ресурсы с этим сталкиваются регулярно и на постоянной основе в целом ряде стран как Европейского Союза, так и ОБСЕ в целом. Достаточно привести простые примеры попытки закрытия счетов, попытки оказания давления на коммерческих операторов, партнеров российских новостных ресурсов по поставке информационного контента и так далее и тому подобное. Далее, относительно новым явлением на пространстве ОБСЕ является создание специализированных пропагандистских институтов, направленных на противодействие и подавления альтернативных точек зрения, излагаемых в информационной среде ОБСЕ и стран Евросоюза в частности. Могу привести простые примеры. Это создание так называемой коммуникационной группы «Восток» и Стратком Евросоюза. Это создание центров стратегической коммуникации в целом ряде стран Центральной и Восточной Европы, в Риге, в Праге и так далее. Все эти институты, по большому счету, ориентированы на пропагандистскую либо контрпропагандистскую деятельность, что, конечно, коренным образом меняет саму структуру и философию информационной среды пространства ОБСЕ, на мой взгляд, в драматическую сторону. Далее. Проблематика фейк-ньюс. Парадоксальным образом, каждый из нас пытается оперировать этим понятием, обвиняя ту или иную страну, те или иные СМИ в попытке использования недостоверной информации в политических целях. Однако никто из нас толком не попытался определить, что такое вообще фейк-ньюс, как фейк-ньюс отличается от misinformation, от falsified information, от disinformation. Нет четких критериев определения методологии и инструментария этого понятия. В этом смысле, я полагаю, нам всем придется хорошо поработать как в рамках ОБСЕ, так и на прочих профильных площадках международных, для того, чтобы понять, с чем мы имеем дело, и для того, чтобы впоследствии выработать некий общий ответ на этот серьезнейший для репутации средств массовой информации современности вызов. Далее. Ни для кого не секрет, что в последнее время многие средства массовой информации из числа тех, что относится к мейнстриму, участвуют в широкомасштабных политических кампаниях в интересах тех или иных государств, направленных на достижение узкоспециализированных политических целей. Отсюда огромная проблема для мейнстримовых СМИ, прежде всего, на мой взгляд, западных, состоящая в резком падении степени доверия аудитории к поставляемым им информации. Прошло менее часа с момента начала конференции, как мы уже услышали упрек в адрес RT со стороны уважаемого сотрудника BBC, что говорит о том, что накал информационного противостояния, очевидно, далек от, скажем так, степени падения. Далее. Поскольку, судя по всему, значительная часть сегодняшней проблематики будет обсуждаться сквозь призму украинского сюжета, конечно, мы хотели бы обратить внимание на пару моментов, связанных с эволюцией украинского законодательства в сторону, по нашему серьезному убеждению, серьезного ограничения функционального и правового свободы СМИ в этой стране. 17 мая этого года указом президента Украины расширен черный список в отношении российских физических и юридических лиц, в том числе журналистов и СМИ, а также санкционирована блокировка российских интернет-ресурсов на территории этого государства. 23 мая Верховная Рада Украины, парламент этой страны, принял закон о языковых квотах, который обязывает телеканалы большую часть дня вести эфир на украинском языке. А 6 июня президент Порошенко этот закон подписал. Несколько дней тому назад руководитель службы безопасности Украины господин Грицак в специально размещенном на сайте СБУ пресс-релизе заявил о необходимости формирования и имплементации в законодательство страны так называемого акта информационного единства, который предполагал бы борьбу с российской пропагандой на территории Украины и предполагал бы за это уголовную ответственность. На наш взгляд, эти тенденции входят в фундаментальное противоречие с основополагающими принципами свободы слова и свободы волеизъявления, которые являются фундаментом тех общеевропейских ценностей, к которым так стремятся наши украинские друзья. К слову сказать, именно Служба безопасности Украины 20 апреля сего года запретила въезд на территорию этого государства присутствующему здесь секретарю Союза журналистов России Ашоту Джазаяну, который парадоксальным образом делал и делает очень многое для того, чтобы объединить профессиональное сообщество журналистов России и Украины. И завтра организует соответствующий сайд-ивент на полях нашей с вами конференции. Уважаемые дамы и господа, российская сторона выступает за формирование объединительной повестки в контексте работы в информационном пространстве. Нам не нужны разделительные линии вслед за теми линиями политического противостояния, которые уже, к сожалению, имеют место быть в Европе. Мы призываем вас к совместной работе, к совместному определению рисков и вызовов и к совместному их преодолению. От фейк-ньюс до дезинформации, от проблематики недостоверных недостоверной информации в СМИ до соотношения авторитетности и эффективности работы как классических СМИ, так и сетевых СМИ. Уважаемые дамы и господа, благодарю за внимание.
Thank you very much. The floor is to Armenia.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I intentionally took the back seat because I think that this forum is more important for journalists to come to first places and to present the challenges which they face. Otherwise, we all know our, of course, state points of view, positions. I would like to thank the Office of the RFOM for organizing this very important conference on such a pertinent topic. I would like to welcome distinguished speakers and to thank them for shaping the framework of our discussions. We are a staunch advocate of the freedom of expression, freedom of media, which are not simply one of the fundamental freedoms, but cornerstone of democracy, and we treat it as such. We agree with the distinguished Mr. Kay that volatility is not limited to armed conflict, but goes far beyond. Volatility in the environment seriously affects the freedom of media and necessitates ensuring safety of journalists. And I would like to add to this also their family members. This is an issue which becomes one of the elements of the ensuring safety of journalists, because one can imagine a journalist who is in exile, who has escaped the regime, but still he is facing threats. His family members who are staying in the country are facing threats, and therefore this is a way to control, to ensure self-censorship of the journalist and not to and to affect, of course, his activities. And we would like to encourage the Office of the RFOM to draw attention to this problem. Another challenge which we faced recently is the practice of export of restrictive measures and censorship beyond the jurisdiction of countries. Such practices include kidnapping and enforced disappearance of journalists from countries, and they also include criminalization of defamation online, when even an offense by internet becomes a huge problem and can lead to detention. And another issue which I would like to raise is the issue of fake news. The distinguished speakers made a number of points. With all of them I agree, but one of the points was especially dear to us is the need to ensure reporting on the spot, because this is the only way to ensure that the information which we get is objective. And certainly I agree with distinguished Ms. Adi that journalist does not need permission to work in the volatile environment, including in conflict areas, but journalist needs simply protection by the government, legal framework, and the rest of the issues are simply of technical nature. Government should assure that accreditation is in place, that the armed units recognize and identify the journalists and let them conduct their professional activities. OSCE has a lot to do in this regard in ensuring full and unhindered access of the journalists to war, conflict zones, crisis zones, to the places where freedom of assembly and freedom of expression are endangered, because this is also a volatile environment. And this is the only way to ensure reporting from the spot, because for too many times, also in this hall, we raised the issue of limiting access of media to the conflict areas under different pretexts. It can be alleged crossing of so-called borders, or drug trafficking, or other crimes which are being assigned to journalists. And I would like to hear from the distinguished speakers what the OSCE as an intergovernmental organization could do in order to promote freedom of media and safety of journalists in volatile environments, having in mind that we are restricted in a number of issues as an intergovernmental organization, and what particularly Office of the Representative on Freedom of Media could do in ensuring full access of journalists to conflict areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Ambassador of Azerbaijan to OSCE would like to welcome the panelists and to thank them for their insights. Also, I wish to express our gratitude to the organizers of this event, of Austrian chairmanship, as well as to the Office of the OSCE Representative of Freedom of the Media. Mr. Moderator, I wish to pick up a couple of points made by distinguished Ms. Adi, BBC journalist, and then to deliver a short statement with few points. The longer version will be distributed in the interest of time. We are in the OSCE, and hence we are bound by the political commitments which each of us try to see the implementation of them. And in case if there is a lack of implementation of the commitment, of course the other all OSCE participating states wishes to improve that pattern and to make use of the office capabilities, RFIM capabilities, to provide more assistance and to engage with the participating states. In the meantime, we have a second dimension, which is not somehow interlinked to the extent we wish with the dimension of the OSCE commitments. And this is the national, I would say, culture of journalism existing in every participating state, be it in the United Kingdom, in the US, or in Azerbaijan. And those two dimensions, they do not coincide. The volume of professionalism, the volume of independence and of objectivity in journalistic activity is different. And the extent of commitments we have here in the OSCE is so limited that we cannot somehow check the implementation of the commitments that we still have not agreed. So in our view, there should be a balance in terms of what we have agreed to and what is the general trend of journalism in the world. And if we have not undertaken the commitments for which we are criticized for, then the organization itself has to improve that set of commitment first, and the rules governing those commitments have to be adopted. And then the journalistic society and community have to push for implementation of those commitments. So in my view, the balance should be between the reality which exists among journalists and the reality which exists in the OSCE. In this organization, we have not acquired that culture of journalism that some of us may think that it exists. And secondly, there should be, in my view, also the definition of journalism. What is consists of? Do we attribute a person who just enjoys posting a couple of remarks or tweets on the websites with the same person who risks his lives, her lives, and reports from a dangerous areas. If we put them on an equal footing, then we might run a risk of compromising the work of journalists who are in the field, but those against those who are sitting in front of computer and tweeting. So in my view, we have to distinguish between those categories of journalism and maybe to elaborate and provide regulation which would distinguish among those criteria, those types of journalism. The third point I wish to make, that is related to the reporting from the conflict areas or on the conflict regions in general. The problem with reporting in view of the governments who are affected by the conflicts is that journalists are considered, according to international law, as civilians, and whatever legal obligations the government has towards the population which is in the conflict-affected area is also applying to those journalists who are visiting those territories. So we have the same volume of responsibilities both to the population residing in those areas and to the journalists. And therefore, we have to provide to them the same level of protection as we are the primary bearers of responsibility according to international law. And in that sense, there are rules which govern the activities of journalists in the conflict-affected areas. First of all, there is a set of international humanitarian law mechanism. There are also UN Security Council resolutions adopted in 2006 and 2015, which are of particular importance for the activity of journalists in the conflict areas, since they set the standards of protection and operation for journalists in those in the situation of armed conflicts or crisis. And such responsibilities, they apply, for instance, to the issues of respect for the sovereignty of states to their territories internationally recognized. Such responsibilities are also calling on member states or participating states to create and maintain in law and practice enabling environment to perform journalists their activities. They, for instance, are also imposing certain restrictions on freedom of expression due to the grounds set out in the Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Those responsibilities are also applicable for journalists, especially for those who use media to incite violence or to describe the situation in a one-sided manner, to promote the situations of conflict, to promote the separatist trends. They have to be governed and regulated, and therefore there is a national legislation as well as international legislation and law which governs them. So failure to follow these clear guidelines, they first of all question the role of media in protection of civilians who are residing in that conflict-affected territory, and as well as the impartiality and objectivity of the reporting from those territories. Finally, we also have in the OSCE in Brussels and in Madrid agreed to adopt voluntary set of professional standards by journalists, where media can adopt self-regulation mechanisms and other instruments to ensure professionalism, accuracy, adherence to ethical standards, and others. So that's why we wish to call on the Office of Representative to work on elaboration of these guidelines on objective and impartial journalists, especially those reporting from conflict situation. And we consider that today's conference is the right step in the right direction and looking forward to its conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Croatia.
No, it's actually Tanja Milin-Horat speaking on behalf of the EU and its member states.
I'm so sorry.
No problem. So at the outset, the European Union would like to thank the head of 2017 OSCE Austrian Chairmanship Task Force, Ambassador Florian Raunich, the director of the Office of the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media, Mr. Frane Marojevic, the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of opinion and expression, Mr. David Kay, as well as our keynote speaker, Mrs. Katie Eddy, for their statements. Freedom of expression and media freedom remain a top priority for the EU, including in the OSCE, and we welcome this initiative by the Office of the Representative. The OSCE is also an ideal platform for such a discussion, given our commitment to the comprehensive concept of security. Indeed, there can be no security without respect for human rights. The RFOM is an essential asset in upholding this commitment. We call on all participating states to engage constructively in order to ensure a speedy appointment of the new RFOM. The link between restrictions to media freedom and conflict regrettably remain evident in our region. We witness attack and other forms of pressure on journalists and other media actors, a growing self-censorship, and the effects of media manipulation. Not least in the context of conflict, restrictions on the media risk creating an information echo chamber that exacerbates divisions. We are deeply concerned about the use of propaganda in Russian state-controlled media outlets, fueling hatred and violence. This is true not least in areas of Ukraine held by Russia-backed separatists, where a systematic disinformation campaign against the SMM is taking place. We see the clear connection between aggressive acts abroad by a state and its repressive domestic policies. We have also been clear in our expectations that Ukraine should do its utmost to uphold its media freedom commitments in this difficult time. In conflicts and crises, journalism itself is at risk. Genuine inquiry and scrutiny is oftentimes replaced by state-fueled propaganda and a narrative based on misinformation and lies. We have seen that some media are instrumentalized to install fear and mistrust, and editorial independence is undermined. Upholding journalistic ethics become more difficult at a time when they are more crucial than ever. Against that background, we welcome the joint declaration on freedom of expression and fake news, disinformation and propaganda that was launched here in Vienna on March the 3rd. We also warmly welcome the continued work of the RFOM in bringing together Russian and Ukrainian journalists in order to seek common solutions. Mr. Chairperson, journalists' work often puts them at specific risk of intimidation and violence. Attacks and intimidation against media actors is not only an attack on the victim, but also on the very essence of freedom of expression. In times of conflicts, the need for a free flow of information and ideas and a genuine public debate based on facts is unattainable without adequate provisions for journalists and other media actors to carry out their work independently. Journalists, bloggers, media actors, and citizens using their right to seek, impart, and receive information, for example, to expose human rights violation, make an important contribution to ensuring justice and redress for such violations. The fact that media actors are increasingly targeted is a matter of deepest concern to the EU. The number of attacks, kidnappings, killings, and threats against these people is growing, and impunity is creating a culture of fear and self-censorship. Together with other restrictions on the media, online and offline, this is a serious problem threatening all of us, diminishing the space for an informed public discourse. UN's Council Resolution 2222, adopted on 27 May 2015, as well as previously agreed international standards, sets out clear obligations in the area of safety of journalists in conflicts, and the EU calls on participating states to redouble their efforts in this area and to put an end to the impunity. We believe that the most effective way to counter misinformation and hostile propaganda is to foster free media and free expression as a platform for the free flow of information, ideas, and opinions, and to encourage media and internet literacy. Also, when discussing distorted or false information, all our commitments related to freedom of expression and media freedom are applicable. While addressing security-related concerns, and indeed false information can have security implications, we must remember the principle underpinning our organization: security and human rights go hand in hand. There is no contradiction between these two, no balance to be struck. Indeed, security in and between states cannot be achieved without respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, including media freedom and freedom of expression. In conclusion, we wish to reaffirm the importance we place on freedom of expression and freedom of the media as cornerstones of the OSCE's concept of comprehensive security. Our region is facing many challenges when it comes to respect for these rights. Current crisis only serves to underline the need for OSCE participating states to do more, individually and collectively, to address these challenges and our own shortcomings. If OSCE participating states want to truly strengthen comprehensive security in our region, freedom of expression and media freedom must be a key component of our efforts and discussions. We hope the recommendations emerging from this conference will inform substantial proposals on upholding media freedom in volatile environments, as well as the wider OSCE work. We look forward to the discussions planned over the next days and to working with other participating states and the OSCE institutions in following them up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see no other delegations. Yes, I see another delegation. Please, Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Thank you, distinguished speakers and dear colleagues. Good morning, and a special thanks goes to Ms. Adi. Impeccable statement, I must say. Thank you so much. I have to make three statements. First of all, I would like to underline and underscore that Ukraine stays fully committed to media freedom despite full-fledged Russian aggression against my country, and we do understand how important media freedom is for a democratic and pluralistic prosperous society. Despite Russian aggression, Ukraine has made consistent progress in implementing reform necessary to support a more open climate for the media. Ukraine has made consistent improvements to the media environment. In 2017, Reporters Without Borders World Press Freedom Index, Ukraine's rating increased 5 places since last year. Many of the government's recent reforms contribute to Ukraine's continued ranking increase. Last year, we launched an ownership transparency mechanism that required television and radio companies to disclose information about the identities of their owners. Furthermore, after a complex year of half a year intensive administrative, structural, and legal reforms, Ukraine's national state-owned TV and radio broadcasters were officially registered as public broadcasters. Our government also began the privatization process of over 200 print outlets in order to protect their editorial integrity. We do recognize that a lot has to be done, more in the future, but a roadblock to our progress in this area is, of course, continuous Russian aggression against Ukraine. In this regard, let me underline the following. In certain areas of Donbass, where the combined Russian separatist forces imposed their de facto control, according to the OSCE SMM, there is a ban of over 350 websites and continued restriction of access to Ukrainian media outlets, both in print and broadcast. At the same time, all independent media were forced to close and to leave the conflict-affected regions. Second, in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, illegally occupied by the Russian Federation in the grave breach of international law, numerous cases of abduction of journalists, killings, and murders occur. 500,000 of ethnic Ukrainians and 250,000 of ethnic Crimean Tatars are deprived of their right to maintain and develop their cultural and national identity in Crimea. We're very much concerned that our people are taken hostages and political prisoners. In this regard, I would like to refer to two Ukrainian journalists who have been held hostages by the Russian Federation, like Roman Sushchenko, who has been illegally detained in Russia on fabricated charges of espionage last year in September, and we do urge Russia to release him immediately. And we also call the CEO chairmanship or its institutions to pay due attention to his case. The second case is the case of Ukrainian journalist Mykola Semena in the occupied Crimea, who has been illegally charged of separatism and is illegally prosecuted by the occupying authorities. We do call also participating states to raise their voice and raise their concern over the illegal persecution by the Russian occupying authorities of our journalists. I must say that the Russian aggression against Ukraine has many dimensions, and one of them, of course, is information war. Russia has real information war not only against Ukraine, it has waged information war against Europe, against the whole world. And judging from the Russian statement today, which we heard, well, I find it pretty predictable. It was quite cynical, but pretty predictable when the Russian Federation spoke about times of turbulence, so-called in inverted commas, about, I would quote in Russian, Ukrainsky sujet, Ukrainian topic. Well, there is no Ukrainian topic, obviously, and obviously there is Russian war against Ukraine, and one of the dimensions, information war, which it has waged. And it uses information as a very powerful tool of propaganda, inciting hatred among people, among nations, among countries. And I do think that our common approach and common response of the OSCE and other international organizations should be to find a common approach and a common mechanism how to deal with Russian false news. I bet they know very well what false news, misinformation, disinformation, propaganda is, and how to deal with this absolutely full-blown and extremely aggressive information policy waged by Russian Federation against the whole world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we see any other delegations wishing to take the floor? UK. Where's UK?
Behind the camera.
Behind the camera. Well
Thank you,
hidden.
Mr. Chairman. I think I'm hidden by the cameras. Good morning, everybody. I should start, of course, by thanking the chairmanship and the Office of the Representative on the Freedom of Media for convening this event today, and by underlining that I fully support the statement made on behalf of the European Union. But I just wanted to add a few words, particularly to thank Kate Adey for being with us today and for giving such an outstanding presentation. I think the response showed that that's definitely one of the most interesting presentations we've had within these walls recently. It was extremely thoughtful and thought-provoking. So thank you for your frank analysis of current challenges that are testing all the states in this organisation, however committed we are to freedom of media and to democratic values. And in particular, thank you for drawing the link between conflict journalism and the broader changing media environment. Ms. Adey, you're here as an independent journalist. You're not here as a national representative, but you don't need any help from me or any other delegation, I'm sure, in responding to any of the comments, including the lecture from the Russian representative on media freedom and integrity. But I would like to say that as well as the representative of the UK, I do chair the Human Dimension Committee of the OSCE, and the committee takes a strong interest in issues of media freedom and the other issues you've touched upon this morning. And I would just like to add that from that perspective, speaking in my personal capacity, I would observe that the vast majority of participating states in this organisation strongly endorse the efforts of the Office of the Representative on Freedom of Media to understand better and to address many of the issues you raise. They are not simple issues. As you say, they are questions that test all democracies. They are not simple questions. There are no simple answers. But we do need to engage on them, all of them. I believe that this is an area where the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, with its institutions, can make a real difference. And I believe that all of us around this table have a shared responsibility to do so. So thank you very much for being with us this morning and giving us so much to think about.
Thank you very much. Do we see any other hands of delegations? US? Yes.
Good morning. Thank you very much. First, I just wanted to welcome the chairmanship and RFOM's continued engagement to keep these issues on the forefront of the OSCE's agenda. Thank you very much for convening this important and timely conversation. We're delighted to see so many friends and partners around the table and are eager to get to the panel, so I'll be brief. The United States is proud to remain the most vibrant, pluralistic media environment in the world. Freedom of speech and of the press are enshrined in our Constitution, and as Secretary Tillerson said in his testimony before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs last week, the administration remains committed to ensuring an open and unrestricted press environment. It's a vital part of transparency and accountable governance. We agree that all of us can do more to strengthen journalist protections. We also agree that there's a need for more fact-based reporting across the OSCE area. And finally, we agree that these issues and challenges need to be addressed democratically and in a manner consistent with our OSCE principles and commitments. We look forward to engaging in a good faith dialogue on these issues today with all of you, and we thank everyone for coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I look around and see no other hands. Yes, we see another hand. Over there, please. Canada. Oh, Canada's over there. And
Norway.
And Norway, yes. So first Canada.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. I'm sitting at the back, so you may not see me, but thank you for giving me the floor. My delegation had not planned to make a statement, but you've reserved some time for that. So allow me to say a few words as well. Because, like other colleagues, we also very much look forward to hearing from civil society, academics, journalists, and experts in the context of this discussion. Canada strongly believes that freedom of opinion and expression remains a cornerstone of safe and prosperous societies and is essential to the realization of human rights for all. Threats to the safety of journalists and other media professionals remains one of the key obstacles, we believe, to the full implementation of these rights. And we are not notably concerned that through new legislation and increasingly harsh tactics, some governments and other actors are seeking to restrict civil society, promote discrimination against individuals from vulnerable and marginalized groups, and also threatening civil society actors, including journalists. So allow me to express with others our appreciation to the Office of the Representative on Freedom of the Media for organizing this conference, as well as to David Kay and Kate Adie for their opening remarks. Mandate holders at the UN, the OSCE, as well as the OAS and the African Union are key voices for freedom of expression and media freedom, and we fully support their work and their mandates to speak clearly and independently in identifying issues and proposing solutions and actions that governments and other actors should take to protect human rights and the freedoms we hold dear. I also want to thank Kate Adie for an incredibly inspirational yet clear-eyed keynote statement. I could not see her from where I am sitting, so this was just like listening to the radio. It reminded me that sometimes images can get in the way of human exchanges with the nuances and experiences that our voices can convey, and the need to use words in order to have well-argued discussions that seek to be based on evidence, science, facts. So thank you for giving us a lot to think about and consider. We look forward to the discussions and the proposed recommendations that will be put forward by the participants and compiled by the Office of the RFOM. I also want to end with a nod to the important comment made by UN Special Rapporteur David Kay on how we should think about volatile environments, notably that we need to consider these perhaps in broader terms than armed conflict situations. After all, we're an organization, the OSCE, that looks at regional security through a comprehensive approach, and we must continue to tackle challenges not in isolation, but through such a comprehensive approach where security, prosperity, and human rights must be advanced jointly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norway. And next to Norway sitting, you will be after that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm Hilde Austad. I represent the delegation of Norway here in the OSCE. I would just also like to join others who have thanked our very eminent and very inspiring speakers for their interventions. Freedom of expression is, of course, a priority for my own government, and we have developed a strategy to support freedom of expression, which also includes support for ensuring free and independent media. And the safety of journalists is also one of the priorities there. I agree with most, if not all, of the points made by Ms. Kate Adey in her very impressive statement. As I said, safety of journalists is important, and I would like to add a question to the question that was asked: what can the OSCE do? What can individual countries do to strengthen the safety of journalists in conflicts? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Your neighbor.
Turkey.
Turkey. Be welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I would like to thank all who contributed to the organization of this conference. I also would like to greet our speakers. Challenges to media freedom abound across the OSCE region, especially in the region affected by the crisis. Promotion of free, pluralistic, and independent media is essential for democracy and for a free and open society. It is the responsibility of all states to take necessary measures to protect journalists and guarantee their right, particularly for those working in conflict areas. Freedom of expression and media constitute an important pillar of Turkey's human rights policies. We enjoy an active, vibrant, and pluralistic media community whose rights are protected by our national laws, international obligations. The protect and promotion of freedom of expression and media were an important part of the comprehensive reforms undertaken our government for over the last decade. In light of the serious and multiple terrorism threats we face, our government is taking proportional measures and does so in a manner that covers a proper balance between fundamental rights and freedom on the one hand and public order and security on the other. Mr. Chairman, on this occasion, I would also like to underline that the importance to sustain a proper balance between the freedom of the media and the responsibility of the media. Reporting on conflicts comes among the greatest ethical challenges to journalists. The media has a great responsibility to ensure that the news they represent is accurate and serve the interest of the people. Unfortunately, the dissemination of the fake news and the lack of ethical standards in the work of the media is one of the major problems we face today. Journalists should avoid hate speech and inflammatory coverage and should report impartially, objectively, and professionally based on correct data obtained from objective resources. I would like to emphasize Turkey's commitment to protect and promote the freedom of expression, the media, on the work resolutely for the improvement of democracy and rule of law in our country and in the OSCE region. On final remark, Turkey has been facing multiple terrorism threats, and there is a fight against terrorism in the southeastern Turkey. It would be misleading to call it an internal armed conflict. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much. Ashwin Raman, you asked for the floor as a war reporter and a speaker of one of our panels, but this session is more reserved to the delegations, so the diplomats, if you don't mind.
Just had a question for Katie.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm not from Russia or Ukraine, I'm from good old India.
Yes.
And I've just returned from Iraq. And we are talking about conflict reporting. I didn't see a single Western reporter there. That is one thing. And we constantly show footage of activist groups and comment on them, or use material filmed by the local cameramen, and the BBC and Channel 4 people stand in front of the camera and talk about it without crediting these brave people. So what are your thoughts on that?
Excellent, thank you very much. And it corroborates, of course, it strengthens what Kate Adie has just said. Time for some reactions by David Kay and Kate Adie. David. Huh? Oh, sorry. What? Kate first. Yes, Kate first. Kate first. Kate first. Sorry.
Let me take the last point first. You raise what is a deep sense of worry in a lot of Western newsrooms that we have not got enough reporters on the ground. This is a complex argument, mainly outlined by security because of the numbers of beheadings of British journalists, those who have disappeared, some who are still missing. It is the concern of newsrooms that they are immediately targeted and directly targeted, as are journalists of many other countries, but we have had a bad experience. There is also the problem of access over borders, where I will say that the northern border to Turkey has proved problematic, not just because of the conflict within Iran, Iraq and Syria, but also because of the Turkish army and the Turkish government. So apologies, and I think all Western journalists will feel this, that we have not got enough people on the ground. And the freelancers are bearing the brunt of it. And it is clear from several statements here as well that the old maxim that, gosh, a foreign journalist has been killed and gets lots of publicity in the West, the people who really suffer are local journalists at the hands of their own governments. Yes. And this is coming clear from here. So we wish we had more people there. Secondly, that moves on to the problem of getting in at times and access. We have had endless problems, we being Western media in Turkey. All I can say that in the name of balance, the delegate, with all due respect, talk of balance. Balance appears to include locking up many senior, distinguished journalists who are in jail this morning. And it's time you looked at the use of your word balance. Going on to two smaller points, and that is when it comes to the argument about, again, balance. How lovely this word is. Mm-hmm. Balance is used. What you can, of course, have in a balance is good on the one hand and bad on the other. And people, it seems to me, don't think that what they are trying to balance is bad. In Azerbaijan, if you're worried about definitions of journalists and you want to argue about balance, I stand in front of you on exactly the same turf as the editor of the Communist Morning Star, right-wing columnists, and the knitting editor of Woman's Weekly, as well as anybody who cares to tweet and does so regularly and gets an audience. We call ourselves journalists in Britain. And I don't think we are any the weaker for that. Stop trying to use the word balance to mean control, because that's what we journalists feel it is. And finally, I won't reply specifically to the Russian statement, except to say that there was a large demonstration seen on most of the screens of Europe that took place in Russia within the last 10 days. When are you going to show it? Where's your balance? Thank you.
Thank you, Kate Adie. David Kay.
Well, I want to start by associating myself with Kate Adie's comments and also thanking her for her extraordinary keynote and her remarks just now. I actually want to address two of the points that she just picked up on, although I will do so in a much less eloquent way. The first is on the issue of balance. And in addition to the points that Kate just made, I think it's critical to think less about balance and more about the standards under international human rights law. So international human rights law does not ask for balance between some ephemeral notion of security and the right to freedom of expression. To the contrary, what human rights law asks and really demands is that states demonstrate that any restriction, any limitation on the freedom of expression is necessary and proportionate to protect some legitimate interest, whether that's national security, public order, or another named interest. So balance gets us to a place where, unfortunately, all of the power is in the state. And the truth is that human rights law is designed to protect individuals, and not just journalists, anyone, everyone who seeks to receive, and impart information and ideas. So I think this issue of balance is an important one for us to address and really to counter. The second point that I want to address that is also similar to Kate's is on the issue of definition of journalism and of journalists. I think it's important, again, to restate that human rights law does not define a journalist. And in fact, as Article 19 emphasizes, it's everyone's right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas. And my sense from following states around the world, really, is that when states go down the path of defining journalists or of forcing them to have the piece of paper that Kate described in her keynote, that almost always heads toward repression of journalism. And so I would urge states not to define journalism and especially not to define who is a journalist, especially right now in a very dynamic, I might even say volatile time when the practice of journalism itself is changing so rapidly. The last thing that I would say is to respond to the question from Norway about what states can do regarding the safety of journalists. This is a crucial question, and I think it goes to 2 points. One is states need to have the laws to deal with attacks on journalists. But perhaps more importantly, because most states do have laws related to attacks on journalists, it's critical that states have the tools to enforce those laws. In some places where there's essentially an epidemic of attack on journalists, it's critical for states perhaps to have special mechanisms to deal with threats to journalists. Maybe that means special investigative units in their prosecutor's office, special units to deal with attacks on journalists. I think that states need to increase their attention to protection and to take what has been a remarkable effort led by the Austrian delegation here in New York and in Geneva to emphasize the question of safety of journalists, to take that international law and that norm making and make it applicable and enforceable at the national and local level. The last thing I would say is unrelated specifically to the questions that were raised, but more generally, I wanted to highlight that the points that I've raised today, and I think that the points that Kate raised are also reflected in 2 of my most recent reports related to country visits that I conducted last year. One, a country visit to Turkey, and one to Tajikistan, where many of the themes that we're addressing today, particularly government limitations that I feel do not meet the standards of necessity and proportionality, that are leading to intensive restriction on journalists and access to information, those reports are available very easily on the UN website, and I would encourage people in this room, particularly because these are states within the OSCE space, to look at those and to think about the issues that we're talking about today in those 2 specific contexts.
Thank you very much, David Kay. Azerbaijan has a small reply.
Yeah, thank you. In the OEC, the balance implies having all dimensions of security at the hand to be sure that we do not miss any risk or challenge to it. So balance in terms of having all dimension of security allows us to, in the first place, to make sure that not only journalists but the entire society are well taken care of the security risks. The second place, journalists are the same profession that such we have in other kinds of labor modes. So we have in Azerbaijan a well-established legal framework and well-established international laws integrated in the national law. But the problem is with the conflict area and the activity of the person who until lunchtime is a so-called freedom fighter, and after lunch he goes and writes about the things he made. That is the problem which we experience. And in that sense, we have to define the responsibility and the rights we accord to journalists, and as well as to distinguish among them, because the journalism in general implies a profession, but not, in my view, just a comment or some kind of remarks a person have in his mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this brings this plenary session to a close, which means that we are way ahead of schedule. I give you 10 minutes to stretch your legs, and then we continue with the second session, freedom of expression and fake news. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Kate Adey and David Kay, for your fantastic contributions to this conference.